Good morning. Good morning. How is everyone? It's my pleasure to be here today to give you a sense of where things are going in the future. I think we have a challenge before us, and I'd like to suggest a couple of key themes to frame this presentation. Let me start out by saying unless we increase energy dramatically, in general, there is not enough energy in the world, in the ground, in the air, based on current plans and trajectories to keep pace with global or national GDP by 2035. Not enough. Now, that statement was actually made by Secretary Abraham during George W.'s first era in a small meeting in Washington where we had been telling administrations for 3 years and 3 times, 3 White Houses, that this was coming, that demand was outpacing supply, and we were not ready. We're still not ready. I want to also suggest that the numbers really give us a glimpse. And my first part of my presentation is going to be to give you the demand drivers about where we're going, but just give you a couple of metrics. Today, the world consumes about 14 terawatts. By 2035, we'll need 40 terawatts of energy. Now, I don't know any energy economist, I don't know any futurist, I don't know any analyst that can tell me how we get from where we are to where we need to be unless we change the energy dynamic. Now, you know something about that. To me, the largest risk, and I'm in the business of forecasting risks, is what I refer to as the petro-risk. This is the largest national security risk that we have facing our nation. The issue is not if, the only issue is when that other 49%, that other 50% of foreign oil dependence becomes complicated by hostile geopolitics. And it will. We don't have to wait very long. The situation is heating up and will continue to heat up. And just having the potential of a risk factor changes markets overnight. But clearly, foreign oil overdependence has not gotten the attention it really deserves as a national security risk in Washington. Somehow that seems to have escaped the policymakers. Somehow that seems to not make a difference. And the economics seem to trump what clearly, as far as I'm concerned, as a futurist, who my clients are not just governments, for the most part, they're corporations, U.S. corporations, who are absolutely concerned about what's coming next. You know, interestingly, the first futurist to actually take a look at all of this was Hubbard at Shell, who made the forecast that we would, after 1970, be losing 50% of our supply and need to import. That has become a too comfortable risk factor that, for all intents and purposes, defines the current environment. And I say we shouldn't be comfortable with that risk because there are alternatives. And you know what those alternatives are. Clearly, biofuels are the future. And interestingly, they're the now. So in the energy conversation, you hear a lot of things about, well, we need more nuclear, or we need more wind, or we need to build more solar. Well, for all intents and purposes, there's not an alternative energy that is not CO2 deploying or non-CO2 that is ready today other than biofuel, and the only biofuel I know that can scale and give us the energy that we need is ethanol. So get ready for what I refer to as the battle for the barrel. Are you ready for that? And we're going to have to get a lot more bold about this future for biofuels. I mean a biofuel infrastructure, a complete one. Because if you, in my business, if you look at the various scenarios for risk factors, assuming conflict is in our future, and it is, there are a variety of folks who have their eye on their oil, not our oil, then you have to consider then a bolder future for biofuels to not just slowly move through the maze and contributing to the pump, but you have to then vertically and horizontally integrate to create the next energy grid, the next vehicles, a complete infrastructure. Because if the oil switch, the foreign oil switch goes off, and the impact of even 10 or 15 or 20% occurs, or even more, I have scenarios that say 30 to 40% goes away, and it could go away, guess what? It could go away in a week. What are the implications? Will we be ready? No, we won't. We need to have a bold future that accelerates biofuels and all different types to be able to get America strong, ready, and secure. For me, the national security implications of not being ready are catastrophic in terms of our security, our health, our economic well-being, and our leadership in the world. Let me say also that what's been underplayed in the whole conversation around this petro risk, which as far as I'm concerned is the largest national security risk, is the issues around climate change and public health. Not a week ago, published in Science, there's a new report about the implications, the impact of pollution, which of course is CO2 driven for the most part, and its impact on Alzheimer's, dementia. So the public health impact associated with petro risk, you're going to hear a lot more information about all of that. Well, let me move forward in my presentation and give you a sense of where I think things are going. Let me blow through what we do. I think you have a sense of all of that. Let me suggest to you that there are four things I'm going to chat mostly about. First is to chart the landscape of drivers. What's going on? What's the world going to look like? Certainly before 2050, certainly before 2030, but over the next decade, the demand drivers of increased population, increased GDP, the next middle class, are going to completely change the energy equation. The only question is, you're going to be ready for that. And how might you accelerate production, innovation in your industry to be able to get us ready for not just a national security risk, but how are we going to feed the next billion folks? In America alone, we could be looking by 2050 at 500 million Americans. You're talking about a big population growth here as well. So let's take a look at this. Welcome to the extreme future. This is a multipolar world of complex risks. Today we're of course going to talk about what's next, but seriously, climate change, the argument over is climate change happening, I think is over. The only question, of course, is, are we ready to be able to manage these complex risks? Geopolitical risks, the Arab Spring risks. You know, it's very interesting. On the other side of the Arab Spring, we will have a variety of quasi-democracies that don't like the United States. Big surprise. On the other side of the affluence and growth of the next middle class, the next billion coming out of Asia and India, we're going to have demand drivers that I can tell you right now, in terms of the carrying capacity of the planet, our ability to be able to provide energy, food, water for the next middle class, billion to 2 billion, I can tell you we're not ready. We are not ready. And energy is at the core of this future readiness. The top global risks, to put this energy in context, are the economy, food, ecology, certainly climate change. And ultimately, it's increasingly going to become security. That's going to be on the front burner of every forecast. So for 2020 and beyond, my forecast is an energy-challenged world. Because energy is at the core, and this energy challenge, or energy as a drag on GDP, regional and global, will become a key feature. And as this rise of affluence and population, I'll break it down for you, we're going to find this drag is going to increase unless, of course, we accelerate supply. And again, there is no supply that's fast enough or ready enough to work in this timetable than the biofuel future. Global population, to give you a little glimpse, it's doubled over the past 45 years. The good news around public health, the good news around economic prosperity, the good news is, hey, guess what? The world is getting safer, better. There's more of us. The bad news is we're not ready. And energy is at the core of that readiness. By 2040, 80% of the world's 8 billion, and it could be slightly higher, will live in developing nations. 9 billion by 2050. The demand drivers alone of this equation of the next new consumers frustrate everybody's ability to look out even 10 years. Forget about 20 years. Forget about 30 years. But that's really what we futurists need to be looking at and challenging policymakers, as well as people on the supply drivers, those that are planning on supply, to be able to keep pace with demand. Because I can tell you, we are entering an era, which I wrote about in my book, The Extreme Future, which I refer to as the two worlds challenge. And there is no issue that's more central that will mitigate this two worlds challenge than energy. The two worlds challenge basically is the challenge between the developed world, predominantly Europe, the United States, Japan, an aging world, the most affluence, productivity, innovation-driven world, knowledge-driven world, increasingly, and the developing world, which is a youth-driven, on its way towards prosperity, developing. The tension and population and wealth tension, demand tension between these two worlds will define the landscape of global competitiveness, global security for the next 100 years. And we could talk all day just about that. But that's the landscape that's going to be driven. That's the tension. At the core of that tension is going to be energy. Clearly an older world, but also a world where the depopulation is a drag on productivity. You have loss of productivity by over a point almost every year in Europe due to depopulation. More people on the dole in Italy than in the workforce. This is a critical problem. In the U.S., we don't have the same problem. But the next 2 billion energy consumers coming out of Asia, particularly, are going to create a completely different kind of energy matrix and are going to be the key demand driver that will reshape the energy landscape. Let alone food, protein, let alone oils. And then the emergence of what I refer to these megacities, 10 million plus. China alone is planning on the better part of 10 to 20 new megacities. And their investments in nuclear are not going to keep pace with the demand. And that's their biggest problem. By 2030, most megacities will be in the developing world. And their demands, the aggregate demands of these megacities also create the largest asset risk at a point where climate change may be complicated. And that in itself will become and have an impact on energy. But this next middle class, China, India, even Latin America, this is the vexing issue that will reshape the global marketplace. The rise of China alone, 1.3 billion people, 700 million of those folks under the age of 25 today, another 300 million under the age of 12. You're talking about a dynamic 9% GDP. The growth vectors associated with the demand for energy, which is at the core of China's GDP growth, is unsustainable unless they move aggressively towards renewables. In fact, they published a report this past year about this renewable future, about clean tech, about biofuels, about moving away from CO2. In fact, they're one of the only nations that published a 20-year forecast and a policy position on energy. I don't recall that we have one of those. Anybody think that we've got one of those? A 20-year forecast for energy? A plan for energy? But the Chinese actually published it and gave it away and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. You would have thought that would have made us think different about all this, right? It didn't. So just my point of suggesting to you is, you know, the world dynamic in terms of the economics of energy is changing dramatically. You've got large emergence of new superpowers. The implications of this are that they're going to be able to, I mean, they're running at 9% plus GDP, 1.3 billion people, another 1.1 in India. You're talking about who's going to be able to pay what for energy. And that's going to have an impact on everything. China will be the world's largest consumer market in the future. Second largest consumer of energy, perhaps the first largest, third largest importer of oil. They'll make up 1/3 of the global population. Biggest food demand. Can't make that stuff without energy. Increasingly, what keeps up the leadership in India and China and most of Asia is, will we be able to have the energy to keep pace with the demand drivers of our society, or we will be facing another cultural revolution? India will be the second world's largest consumer market. Again, these markets are not in 20 years. We're talking about emerging over the next decade. A dynamic global marketplace with 3 billion new consumers is coming fast, and at the core of all that lifestyle change, of all those demands, is going to be one thing: affordable, plentiful energy. I said earlier about the Arab Spring. My forecast about the Arab Spring is there's this new emerging geopolitical place in between being really hostile towards U.S. interests and being friendly to U.S. interests. Just not that pro-U.S., anti-U.S. And the implications for that moving forward over the next certainly 5 to 10 years on the other side of the Arab Spring, so that nobody has a fairly, overly optimistic perspective, that's going to also be an impact on, or let's say increase the petro-risk impact on our national security. It's not going to be productive. Energy security is also increasingly, there have been, and I had forecasted this a number of years ago, you're going to increasingly find that energy security or energy itself becomes a target for a variety of rogue interests, terrorism and crime. This past year was very interesting. It was the first time that carbon credits, and I put this in a scenario a number of years ago, carbon credits were actually hacked and stolen, carbon credits. Now, I don't think we're yet at a point where we're trading ethanol credits or biofuel credits, are we? But isn't that part of the association's plan for the next couple of years here to set up a marketplace to trade biofuel credits? Yeah, it's already happening. Can I get a seat on the exchange? I think it's in Chicago, right? A vibrant marketplace. So my scenario that I had forecasted, which came true, which astounded me the most, was the hacker group, criminal organization, not terrorist, was able to secure carbon credits and then remarket them. It wasn't much. I think it was under 20 million. Does that portend something for the future? Without a doubt. The associated virtual instruments and asset values that translate into a marketplace that now globally is traded. Let's talk about now energy. So those are the demand drivers. Population, certainly. Those are the complications. Let's talk a little bit about what I think is going to happen. So here is kind of my map of the future of energy. certainly well before 2025. You've got to think about these things as accelerating quickly now. And there's 10 of them. So the extreme future of energy, let me break these down. We've talked about some of them. We'll move on. I'll give you some data. Certainly population growth is the big story. 8 to 9 billion. Another 2 billion plus is 7 billion people on the planet. These are big numbers. Next, middle class. We talked about that. Increased GDP. Could be looking at the better part of 3.5% to 4%. But if GDP, global GDP starts to tick up closer to 6%, 7%, you could be, again, a drag on that is energy availability, the right price, supply, or you're talking about a inability to be able to get past somewhere around 4 to 5% may be associated with expensive energy. I've talked about security and the petro risk. Let me just say, fast climate change is an issue. Accelerated climate change is going to increasingly be something we're going to be facing. There's a lot of anomalous weather behavior around the U.S. Tornadoes in New York, earthquakes on the East Coast, that quite frankly, in my conversations with climatologists, would suggest that we're now dealing with a new dynamic about climate change. Accelerated, fast climate change. Clearly, CO2 is a critical part to all of that. It's not just about pollution, but I think we're increasingly going to be able to be developing models, and we need to press on the public health issues associated with this because we're not doing enough. You all know that if you're in biofuels. Green alternative energy, we'll talk about what's next for that. There's other things other than biofuels. I'll give you a sense also where I think some further out innovations are going. Geopolitical risk factors are interestingly not just about who we don't want to deal with or those suppliers that are politically not our friends. We could be looking at a variety of global risk factors associated with politics that just complicate the supply chain, that just impact the supply chain in a way that our fragility, meaning that demand fragility that we have and dependence, will create a problem. If you have a destabilization in parts of the Middle East and Asia, where conflicts that may not involve us at all, Syria and Turkey, good example, Iran and Israel, it may not directly affect us, but they may affect us through surrogates or allies. At the end of the day, the geopolitical risk factors are increasing. I would say they're 3 to 5 times greater now than they were even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I view them increasing over the next 15 to 36 months. Food and water stress, another key issue associated with energy that drives the energy equation. And unstable economics. I don't think anybody thinks for a moment that we are out of the woods when it comes to, you're looking at the stabilization of the EU, you're looking still at digging out of the real estate asset debacle here and digesting the politics and economics of stabilizing the U.S. You're not talking about let's say we've got a certain degree of stability. I'm forecasting the instability around the world will impact the U.S. increasingly this next year even, or over the next 24 months at least. I think GDP will be up in the U.S., but a certain drag on that will be what's going to happen in the EU. They're going to go sideways. And of course, Asia is going to will be faced with more instability because of an asset and banking crisis. And increasingly, energy will be a key drag, I think, particularly in Asia, China's GDP. Now, the big, of course, issue is what's going to happen with consumer demand. Increased consumer demand studies that we have would show that with the U.S. economy improving, GDP ticking up, productivity ticking up, and the demand drivers coming from outside the U.S. would lead us to make the statement, we're not future ready. In talking to my large food companies, energy companies, and just in general, we're not future ready. We're not ready for the new demand dynamics of these new consumers. So now let me break down some of the other pieces of this pie so you get a full risk understanding. what I refer to as the high petro-geopolitical risk. We talked a little bit about that. The one piece of that is the price instability. The price instability factor is kind of like, it's kind of smoke and mirrors. All of a sudden, oil becomes reasonable. This battle for the barrel, we need a new dynamic to understand the battle for the barrel. Because I don't think it's just going to be based on price, which we've gotten lulled into. I think it's now a much bigger opportunity. Here's what CO2 looks like in 2030 in terms of the lighter tan is where it's going. Now, most of these numbers, I want to say, are based on biofuels not happening, really. Okay? So when you're looking at these numbers, you say, wow, look at that. The U.S. is going to be doing better in 2030. It's not as bad as it was in 2007. Actually wrong. Why? Because my business look at data and research, or you can make any case with it you want. But I can tell you that this was really prior to all the good work that you all have done in terms of biofuels and ethanol. This does not contemplate a more aggressive supply of biofuels, and these numbers actually should look very different by off perhaps as much as 30%. But clearly there are some things that make sense. 2020 U.S. emissions, it's all about power plants. So my earlier statement that we need a smart, a biofuel smart grid infrastructure that goes after a very bold vision. It's an infrastructure that takes us not just from, the pump for the cars, but takes us, as we heard earlier in the address about biorefineries, we need a complete infrastructure that can tie it all together. We're going to need a whole different way of thinking about it. We're going to think about cities of the future that are fueled by biofuels, and we'll see them. We need to have car companies come out with complete solutions that are total biofuel solutions. We need to have the electric grid, which is really based on a 19th century model in the U.S., be ready to accept biofuels as a dominant energy source, not just a play-along source, but a dominant source. Why? I have, in California, where I live, right? I had one of my vendors showed up for a meeting, and we were having lunch and all, and he said, so, are you going to finish your French fries? I said, what do you mean? Well, I need the oil. I need the oil for my car. True story. And he went out and he grabbed the oil and he went out and he poured it into his car. Couldn't make it up, right? Because he had retrofitted his Mercedes, his older Mercedes, to be able to accept that, right? So people, there's this manufacturing, this maker revolution, which is people are tinkering with stuff, That's the nation we are. At the end of the day, just like, the conversation between the president of GM and Tesla, that little upstart company in California that's creating a battery-operated, car, got about $1 billion+ in U.S. loans, right? And the conversation goes like this: how come we didn't do that? How come you got a little upstart company that did that? I think a bold biofuel future is what we need to make America safe, strong, and sustainable. Also, this is 2080. This is an interesting challenge. This is kind of the flip side of this, right? So the flip side of this is that what's interesting about this forecast is that by 2080, which is a lot of years out, right? This is the reduction in agricultural productivity based on increases due to climate change. Now, why I point this out is if you really wanted to bang this drum, right, it's in nobody's interest that the agricultural producing capabilities of the U.S., for whatever reason you've got, whether it's food or security or fuel, need to be depleted. All right? I don't think we need to redo the manufacturing thing. We did that, right? And now we're trying to redo that, right? We're trying to reset manufacturing. Do we really want to reset agriculture? I don't think so. So at the end of the day, these numbers could be significantly reduced as such. Residential consumption by 2035, just to give you a kind of a metric here, it's not going away. This is quadrillion BTUs in 2035, just to give you an idea. You know, the world is not using less, it's using more. Now, what's interesting about this, it's a little hard to see, but let me just direct you to, I think I got a pointer. Okay, I don't have a pointer. The point is that this kind of shows you a map of where all the greatest risk factors are and opportunities are. And all the way over on the top, the most optimal positive climate impact with the best energy, you notice, is ethanol, corn ethanol, and then up cellulose. All right? And this comes from a fairly progressive World Resources Institute study, okay? Looking at lots of different stuff. That upper right quadrant is where you want to be looking. Ethanol is right there. Biofuels are right there. Even better than plug-in. You know, it's very interesting, the car as a driver of this entire conversation, the auto. Why? I remember when hybrids were just emerging and J.D. Power and all the key authorities in the auto industry said, you know what, no one's going to ever adopt those. Forget about that. This is just going to be a little trend. Nobody cares about that stuff. Why? Boy, were they wrong. I took a leap around that. They were wrong. You know, I've studied the car industry in the U.S. It's very interesting. As the global economics of oil were changing in really the 70s and 80s, and starting in the 70s, but certainly in the 80s, you had a mindset problem in Detroit. And it was Americans are always going to want large cars, they're always going to want gas-guzzling cars, or that's the American way, bigger, better. All of a sudden, you had people that came here from Japan, people that came here from Europe, said, you know, we got a different sensibility about this. Their ability, when Toyota was first asked about penetrating by Fortune magazine the U.S. auto business, and the reporter was, this is the conversation going on in the 50s and in the 60s, the executive from Toyota said, we have a 25-year plan to penetrate the market. But the mindset of American leaders, and this is what I'm trying to get at, was not there yet. I think they're slowly getting there. But I think the conversation has a lot to do. Let's talk a little bit about innovation, and I don't think it's all about just biofuel. I think biofuel is critically important. I want to just give you a sense of where I think things are going, just in terms of the future of energy, so I do my job, right? Innovation drives competitive advantage. It's innovate, or die. Probably what's next, and I think the beginning, let's just say the beginning of the innovation revolution in biofuels, you know, it's just starting. And that's what's exciting about this. You know, in my world, we deal with, I worked with Steve Jobs, right? And he had this statement, I was on the original Mac team at Apple, and he had this statement that we all embrace, which is to think different. What does that mean? It means think about the possible. Don't look at the usual status quo. Don't follow the rules. Think different. And I've tried to do that in my career, but I will tell you right this. We need to innovate or die, and I mean deeply innovate, not just innovate in terms of how we present biofuels. You're ahead of the game with that, I think, but also to innovate in terms of what we do with the higher yields that might come from that. And there's new technology and innovation buckets that are emerging. Synthetic biology. I think what's happening in biology, which will have a huge impact on biofuel development, is critically important. What's next in terms of blending, I said earlier about this infrastructure of batteries and electricity, and think beyond the pump. Think beyond the pump in this battle for the barrel. But we've got to continually innovate, and there's a lot of new things that are emerging. Fast breakthroughs. So this is nanotechnology. This is an engine that was created from carbon balls. Nanotechnology it's the ability to be able to manipulate matter at the atomic level. The implications for energy and creating energy sources could be fantastic. We spent in the U.S. $1 billion plus over 3 administrations to seed and create this global industry that is now $40 billion a year and still in its infancy. And the one area that I've been waiting for, the one area that I think nanotechnology is going to make the huge difference about, of course, which will impact this electronic smart grid, is going to be energy. The ability to be able to blend it. The reason I say that is because you may want to spend some time at the local university and talk to some of these graduate students regarding energy. You're going to find that some of these new technologies, quite frankly, might have a place in you thinking bigger about what you all are doing. Why? After all, your dollars are paying for nanoscience, nanoengineering. Your dollars are paying for these next innovations. Your dollars are paying for what we're doing at the National Science Foundation. And we're part of the largest innovation explosion going on the planet, and biofuels are right in the core center of that. Now, what this is an interesting model. This shows where we are through 2050 in terms of what are the emerging technologies that will have an impact on energy, okay? This just gives you an overview, right? Notice that fission or nuclear on the far left there, you know, that's going to be part of the mix, but again, polluting, even though it's non-CO2, it's CO2 friendly, at the end of the day, it's still polluting. There's still lots of problems. The biggest problem is cost, and the other problem is, guess what? I don't have a growing season for nuclear. It's a long growing season. I don't know I'll make the next couple of plants. And I don't mean the kind that grow, right? Talking 10, 15 years. 8 to 15 years on the short end. Notice at the end of the day, though, you're talking about a lot of the alternatives, the green alternatives are there. I don't think hydrogen is going to emerge as fast, but core right in the middle of it is biofuels. Again, this model was developed prior to the thinking about and the emergence and success of ethanol. My forecast is the biofuel piece will become bigger, but all the way on the far right, other than solar and geothermal and all that, there's a little technology that is far out. We'll talk about that, and that's fusion. So this extreme future about using biology to be able to help better our world, or hacking biology, is critically important to all this. New fuels will come from hacking matter. Advanced yields, the application of synthetic biology to biofuels, increase yields, kind of thinking about ways of applying synthetic biology, which is like engineering biology to ethanol. I think that's an interesting perspective. Clearly, the geoengineering challenges that are associated with climate change are vexing. But when I refer to advanced ethanol and biofuels, I want to give you an analogy. So, for instance, 1 glass of seawater we think could produce potentially 500,000, the equivalent of 500,000 barrels of energy in a fusion experiment. Now, we're not there. We may not get there for 25 years. The largest fusion experiment going on right now is going on in Europe, actually, with the French. They're betting on all that. But I want to let you know there are advanced technologies, and there's some really great out-of-the-box thinking that's going on around this industry that could impact this industry. And I would make a wild forecast that I believe that some of these technologies, certainly nanotechnology, certainly what's next in terms of synthetic biology, will have a huge impact on this industry in the future, as well as other technologies, like you're going to hear a lot more this year about big data analytics, cloud computing. That is going to play an important role, I believe, in creating a new biofuel infrastructure. So the smart energy grid is about tying together all the suppliers, all the users, and creating a new way to move energy around the nation. You need to get into this conversation. This is not just a conversation around growing new biofuels and putting them in pumps. This is a conversation about creating a new smart infrastructure where you tie it all together. You move upstream. The infrastructure is how we think about energy and how we use it, everything from industrial to consumer. That's a different conversation. A biofuel smart grid with ethanol as the core has not happened yet. We need some big thinking around this. Big thinking. Why? Because this is the big thinking that's going on in energy in this nation. We're thinking about grids. We're thinking about networks. We're thinking about how we're going to get from where we are to where we need to be. And my feeling is, and where I'm at the table is, certainly that biofuels need to be an integral part of this and maybe even need to drive that conversation. And that's a big conversation because you're talking about, to do this right, you're talking about $100 billion. And we've got to do it. But we've done it before. And having a different kind of future energy mix with biofuels and other alternatives, which are not as sustainable, they're not as scalable as we need, is going to be a critical part of this future. And we're going to see wild kinds of things that are going to provide one piece of it, maybe 1 to 3%, as we've seen from wind power capacity today. Space-based solar will emerge over the next decade. We'll see new schemes around this. Solar arrays. There are actually experiments going on now. Some wild experiments. I'm an advisor to the Defense Department. We're looking at a variety of things. And I can tell you, they're all about renewables. They're all about sustainable renewables. We're not looking at any petro-risk things that we're dependent on. I can tell you right now. The next generation of fusion, which we can't do yet, just so everybody's clear about this, we can't do it yet. But again, we couldn't do nanotechnology when we put the first $1 billion in. We had no idea. We had an idea it would create jobs. We had an idea. The science was there. Well, the science is here for fusion. The science is here for advanced biofuels. What I'm trying to say is biofuels are a critical part of where we're going in this future and building the next cities. So in summary, let me just say this. Look, bioenergy infrastructure, as far as I'm concerned, is the future. Think different. Think big. Think beyond just the particular biofuel. Think about an infrastructure that would be complete, and what are the drivers of that infrastructure to be able to make it happen. Why? Because from a national security point of view, we are at risk. This petro risk is going to continue, and we may not be future ready. Ethanol is the core of that, and new advanced biofuels. For all of you who are in the business, you got a university near you, stimulate research. They're looking for some direction. How do we get a better, faster yield? What are the ways to tie into the local infrastructure? How could we start dealing beyond the pump to create other kinds of vehicles, other kinds of mass transit that could connect all this? How could we use biofuels in a way even we're not thinking? What's the white space around the future of biofuels that's relevant in your community? That's a different conversation. And I know some of you in that conversation. But advanced biofuels will protect America's future economy and our security. Because what's today, the risk that we have today, simply put, 50%, a bit less, of our current and our future, it is not acceptable to be comfortable with that risk factor. And we need to do something about that. Petro risk is geopolitical suicide. And I'm not against oil. I'm pro-oil. But I am smarter for, and my allegiance is to a sustainable, renewable future that will protect America, not just today, but for the future. So, as I said earlier, we're in the battle for the barrel. Think differently. The risk factors that are associated with this are not just about today's dollar. They're about your grandchildren. They're about the sustainability of the nation. They're about big stuff. Not just giving jobs to farmers, which is good. Not just revitalizing agriculture, which is good. We're talking about big stuff. We're talking about creating the next America. Are you all ready for that challenge? If you are, then you're ready for what I think is going to make America strong. Thank you very much.